Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start our program back up. We'd like to invite everyone to please come back into the room and take a seat. Again, we are about to start the program again, and we would like all of you to come back into the room and take a seat. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce Amina, our moderator, and this session will begin right now. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Amina Saber. I'm, just to introduce quickly myself, I'm a political scientist and program director at the French-American Foundation in Paris. For those who are wondering what French-American Foundation is, I would say that our mission is to perpetuate more than 2 centuries of shared ideals and friendship, to build lasting practical working ties, and to advance solutions to problems of shared concern. So it's a great honor for me to host this discussion dedicated to women and public affairs within this first edition of the Paris-Boston Women Forum. So to frame a little bit our subject, I would say that the underrepresentation of women in both politics and higher administration is startling. So we'll try here to focus in this panel on 2 important and related dimensions. First, how we can encourage more women to embark on a career in public policy in order to become the political leaders of tomorrow. And second, how universities, and that's why we're all here today, how universities can develop an interdisciplinary approach in order to incorporate questions related to gender in any degrees, and I insist in any degrees, whether it's science, engineering, which we addressed this morning, political science, humanities, or arts. We are very lucky to have here with us this afternoon 4 amazing women that I personally would have loved to meet when I was myself a student. So please, if you have questions for them, don't hesitate during the Q&A session to engage discussion with them. We have first Victoria Batson. Victoria, you are a founder and the executive director of the Women and Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School. You also founded and chairs the program named From Harvard Square to the Oval Office, a political campaign practicum, preparing basically women to run for public office. You have trained over 600 Harvard graduate students, among them 2 ministers in office now in France, Amélie de Montchalin, Minister for European Affairs, 34 years old. And Brune Poirson, Minister for the Ecological and Inclusive Transition, 37 years old. So I would like here, Victoria, to thank you for having contributed to inject fresh air in the French political landscape. Then we have Brenna Callahan. Brenna, you serve in Mayor Wall's office of Women Advancement, so here at the City of Boston. You work externally to promote gender equity in the city, and you specifically manage the department economic equity policy portfolio with the program Boston for Pay Equity Model. So Brenna will tell us how Boston is probably one of the most advanced cities in the country tackling these issues. Insaf El Hassini, so coming straight from Paris, I hope she's not too jet lagged yet. Insaf, you're an international lawyer. You're the founder of Lean In France, which is the official French and Francophone hub for the Sheryl Sandberg and Dave Goldberg Family Foundation. You are facilitating a workshop on salary negotiation in France and worldwide, which you are going to bring to a next level, but you will tell us more about this in a minute. And Jenny Stephens. Jenny, you're the director of Northeastern School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. Thank you for hosting us. And you're as well the Dean's Professor of Sustainability Science and Policy. You're also the Director for Strategic Research Collaborations at Northeastern Global Resilience Institute. Your research, teaching, and community engagement focus on social political aspects of renewable energy transformation, climate resilience, gender diversity in energy and climate, and social economy and racial justice in climate and energy policy. So thank you all for being here. And let's jump straight into our subject. And now I wanted to start with you, Victoria. Could you describe the origins and achievements of your Women and Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School, which set an example for other universities all around the world? So what do you identify as the biases today, and how should they be addressed? And how do gender equality and diversity interact?
Wonderful, my pleasure. And first, I had wanted very much to thank the Consul General so much and his team for putting this together. It is really incredible for us to be able to build these exchanges, and you'll hear within what I talk about today also why it matters so much, not just for the work of equality, but for the stability and economic prosperity of nations. And I also want to thank Northeastern for hosting us today. So I have been at Harvard University for 22 years. When I first began, we could put all the women students in one room. The cultural landscape for the United States, looking at it from a comparative lens to other nations, we were behind and remain behind in women's political representation. To give you a landscape of that, when you look at the Nordic countries, they have, in terms of representation of women in their parliamentary bodies, they're up around 42%. When you look at the rest of Europe, it's about 28%. When you look across the Americas, not just the United States, you're seeing around 30%. Sub-Saharan Africa is 23%. And when we look across Asia, it's about 20%. And the Middle East and North African region is, again, looking at around 19%. When I began this work, not quite 20 years ago, those last three categories, Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, North African region, was about 0. Okay. The United States has remained roughly the same. We've come up just a bit. So when we're looking at this dialogue for how we view it in a global context, it's a global problem that we all need to solve together. This is something which we won't solve in isolation. And I convened all the women students in one room, and I said, how many of you wish to run for office? One hand went up. And it's very important that we look at data. Everything that we do is evidence-based. I believe any gap that we can measure, we can close. But sometimes the data doesn't tell us the whole story. And I thought to collect a group of women who were academically successful enough to get into Harvard and thought enough of themselves and had enough confidence to apply to Harvard, were in a school of government, I thought it is likely impossible that only one woman in this whole room believed that she wanted to be more than the best foreign policy analyst or advisor. So my view was, if we build it, they will come. So we created a program called, as Amina said, From Harvard Square to the Oval Office, to help train women to run. And my colleague, who is from Lean-In in France, will certainly understand, and I'm sure has the same type of lens, that it's not an issue that women don't have training. It's really about raising the benchmark of aspiration. I don't believe women either lack political interest or political ambition. They lack systematic support for their ambition, both culturally and then within specific institutions. So how is it that we can build a program to overcome these barriers? And because we're all in the same cultures, it's not that, old thinking was that men had biases which kept women back. New understanding shown to us in the data is that women and men equally hold women back because we're all in the same cultural frameworks. And so how do we get over it? So the first is we try to demystify the process, because women have much higher social sanction for failure. They need to know, which is a rational behavior, they need to know what exactly are the rules of the game. Then secondly, we had the president of Northeastern talk beautifully this morning about networks, invention, and reinvention. Secondly, we create role models so that with demystifying the rules of the political systems, we can then also give them examples. And what we do is, the dream was that we could bring back women from the local, legislative, national, parliamentary levels who had literally gone through the training program to come back and say how they did it. So my colleagues Amélie de Montchalin and Brune Poisson will both come back and speak to the program this year, so that, again, the gap between aspiration and reality, we can literally walk them through how women did it. It's not abstract. We also bring what I like to call the sparklies, the women that everybody knows. Hillary Clinton has come for the program, Nancy Pelosi has come from the program, and Northrop. And a key aspect of any of these programs, in addition to the hard skills, which we teach them, the mentoring so that they can see that it's possible, is then this real functioning network. And it's a network, and I'm going to quote one of my former students who is also a former member of the US military, and she said, as women, we need to hold each other accountable for our talent. My frame of reference is not so much achievement as it is service, and that in each of our societies, every individual, regardless of race, class, sexual orientation, geography, cultural background, should be empowered to provide their most significant service as they would wish to. Our program does not in any way favor or discriminate against any political party, about any political view, that rather than saying this is an agenda we want to put forward, I view my work as providing women the tools to have equality, and what they do with those tools is up to them. For many years, organizations from across the world would come and ask us, and I want to recognize my friend and colleague Giovanna Manfred, who has worked with me on the development of this program, particularly our international expansion, and we didn't quite have the time to put it together. And as our federal work here in this country and my work with the Obama administration and the White House Council on Women and Girls came to a close with the dissolution of that office, I took that time and decided to boundary it. And for us to now work with colleagues, we've had a wonderful partnership with our colleagues at Sciences Po. We work with a consortium of universities in Japan, University of the Netherlands. We have a collaboration in Israel, a collaboration in Ecuador, Colombia, India, and many other locations are coming online. And rather than looking at it from a lens of we, in essence, create knowledge and pass on knowledge, we look at it from a lens of we're part of a global community building tools and interventions to solve this problem. So we all exchange ideas. We're developing a community of both practice and we hope eventually scholarship to study the different programs and to learn from each other and adapt. And a side piece which has developed out of this, I'd love to tell you that we were clever enough to know we were creating this from the beginning, but we have made an actual network of policymakers around the world, so when good policy ideas have been tested in one location, they can be amplified and translated to another, and people can learn and adapt. So in brief, that is the type of work which we have been working on. I'm very happy to talk about other things as the panel progresses, and thank you.
And, thank you. Thank you, Victoria, very much. Just a quick precision. When a few months ago you were in Sciences Po and you spoke of cultural and structural barriers.
Yes.
Could you please develop? And
Sure.
within this international experience on cultural and structural, what you noticed?
So when we think of cultural barriers, every society in the world expects women to provide service and to provide support. And all cultures have a higher social sanction for women's failure, for women's movement outside the home. The gradation of those barriers varies, and none of it is static, right? This is an iterative and engaged process. I believe there's only two things that provide women equality anywhere in the world. And the first is statutory protection. Within any nation, that a woman has protections which are granted by law and enforced. And we could literally write a list from now until tomorrow what those are. Freedom of movement, the right to bodily integrity, the right to own land, the right to be a full citizen, the right to stand for public office, the right to be able to speak in public. We talked earlier about entrepreneurship and tech and venture capital, access to capital, access to credit, ability to inherit, and on it goes. But when we talk about legislative and policy-based rights, they're always footprints in sand. They can always be wiped away. So that work is work of vigilance. And every community or every state or province and every nation is on a journey towards women's full equality within the law, or we hope that they are. But it takes consistent and regular action to ensure that that trajectory is moving, because it is not linear. People like to imagine that it's linear, just like democratization. People like to imagine that it would be linear, but no data supports it as linear. And then the second piece is women need to have the ability to support themselves, and one in the literature would call them their dependents, but I would say those people that they love, over the arc of their adult life. So whether or not a woman chooses to activate her ability to economically sustain herself, if she doesn't have that, the chance of her being free or equal is very small. And I believe it's really the interplay of these two pieces which provide equality. So when we look at cultural barriers, there's always the interplay of cultural barrier and rule of law. And that it's not just that we need to change a cultural frame and then women will be elevated. It's that by elevating women, we change the cultural frame. And so then the second piece, when we look at that, is the structural barriers. Today, we're seated together in the United States. The United States political system by structure is a first-past-the-post system. It's a winner-take-all system. It takes one more vote than the other person. Because maleness is associated with leadership, and if one has one vote, it is more likely that that one vote will align to the paradigm of leadership, and you're more likely to have male candidates. So even with our last year of the woman, and many of you in this audience are old enough to have been through, as I have, many years of the woman, and it would be great if we didn't have a year of the woman. Really, we get a year now and then. We need a full engaged society. But here we don't have structural interventions. We do at the party level. The Democratic and Republican parties, governed individually in most states, have equity rules about having both men and women on their steering committees, but we have no quotas or reserved seats in our parliament. Whereas in many places around the world, and if we looked at the market leaders, so the US is about 76th in the world when we look at political participation. Our colleagues from France, I envy you. You are at about 17%. And we tend to topple. Before the 2018 electoral cycle, we were about 100th. But in many parts of the world, they have structural interventions, and by having a quota system or reserved seats, more of the seats go to women. There's very good research by some of my colleagues, which shows that when the first woman takes that reserved seat, people don't like her. They're uncomfortable with her leadership style. They don't think she's doing a good job. People are uncomfortable. When the second woman serves in that role, they begin to forget that she's a woman. And they focus on the policy issues. More women speak up in the bodies in which this woman is presiding. And by the third woman, people don't remember that she's a woman anymore. There are new and different policy issues that come forward, which might be access to water, it might be how land is transferred, and you begin to see examples where parents even aspire to have their daughters in politics. So cultural change and structural intervention actually have an interplay. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much. We'll go back later to the legislation comparison or point of view and the right level to act or to interact. Local, we're going to see that with Brenna, international with the G7, which happened a few weeks ago, or national with what you were mentioning with the legislation in France. Jenny, I would like to, these days we are in the middle of the UN General Assembly. And we saw with political activist Greta Thunberg's speech, we saw plenty of articles in the press, and especially in France, questioning, I quote, "What if women were about to save the world?" And speaking of ecofeminism, in your forthcoming book, Diversifying Power to Save the World, to be published in a few months, I guess, you argue that effectively addressing climate change requires diversifying leadership, redistributing wealth and power, and moving beyond mainstream male-dominated technocratic solution to climate change. So could you tell us more about your research that led you to that book and to that conclusions?
Great. Well, thank you. It's great to be here and have this opportunity to talk. And I think my perspective, what we're really getting at is diversity of ideas and approaches to thinking about the grand challenges of the world. So I'm part of kind of a growing number of engaged academics here at Northeastern and in universities around the world that are doing interdisciplinary research on sustainability and resilience, particularly related to how society is responding to and preparing for the disruptions of global environmental change, what a lot of people now are referring to.
Your hair. Thank you.
Sorry if you couldn't hear. Should I?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
It's fine. Just go on.
Really thinking about what people are, how we're responding to what a lot of people now are considering the climate crisis. And I've been doing this work for more than 20 years. And what's frustrating is that over this 20 years, the situation has gotten worse. In terms of all the trends are actually going in the wrong direction with climate change, with greenhouse gas reductions, and the risks are accelerating for humanity. So recently I've been spending time thinking about why has it been getting worse? Why have we not been able to address these challenges? And why have we not been more effective? And a lot of it has to do with cultural change, which we've been talking about quite a bit today. And I've come to realize that the problem and the solutions really depend on diversifying who is involved and who is included and who is excluded from the discussions and the policy and the decision-making at every level. So as was mentioned earlier in the session this morning, that we need to get beyond technocratic, technology-focused ideas and really think about cultural change, and that's a lot harder, oftentimes. So with issues of environment and sustainability, the research really tells us that diversity is essential to address these issues, and that there are many benefits to society in having more diverse representation that are much beyond the benefits to the women or the people themselves who have the opportunity. So a lot of, and I guess I wanted to spend just briefly talk a little bit about the research that that bolsters this position. So one set of research really shows that having more gender diversity in leadership promotes more sustainable practices and policies. There was a study just published within the last couple of months that shows that countries with the largest representation of women adopt more stringent climate change policies, and they looked at 91 countries, and that actually relates to lower carbon dioxide concentrations in those countries. And the conclusion of the study was that female political representation is an underutilized tool for addressing climate change. So there's a lot of other environmental sociology research that demonstrates that women have greater awareness and concern for environmental issues. So there's a whole section of benefit to society of having gender diversity related to the political and the sustainability practices and policies. Another whole set of research and another benefit to society of having more gender diversity is really about promoting broader societal engagement on environmental issues, and particularly here I'm referring to, I've done a lot of work in the energy sector, looking at this transformation that is underway, moving away from fossil fuel-based energy systems toward more renewable-based energy systems. And the energy sector is very male-dominated, and there's research to show that having more women in the sector promotes broader societal engagement. People in the workforce bring home what they work on to their families, their households, their communities. So there's benefit in diversity there too. And the final big category, which has also been mentioned earlier, is that greater gender diversity actually accelerates innovation. We know there's a lot of research that shows how more diverse teams and more innovative teams are more innovative. There's lots of examples there. So in terms of one of the challenges, I think, is that climate change is disruptive, and the solutions or the approaches to confronting the challenge of climate change is also disruptive. Mm-hmm. So many people in power don't want there to be change, and those people, many are feeling threatened by the change that is happening. If you look at the climate strike, millions of youth around the world last Friday and multiple Fridays in sequence are striking and calling out leaders and saying this isn't fair. There's intergenerational justice issues here. And that, as you mentioned, that movement has most recently been spearheaded by Greta Thunberg, who is a young 16-year-old woman from Sweden, and she, if you mentioned in France when she
earlier, when she was invited a few months ago by a few members of the parliament to make a speech in the Assemblée Nationale, and there was lots of issues in the press of most of them conservative member of parliament, of course male, stating how a 16-year-old young lady is going to teach us our job, basically. Yeah. So it was really rude, the discussion around her presence at the parliament.
And here in the United States, we're seeing the same thing. Just this morning, Fox News had to apologize because one of their commentators said very rude, dismissive things about her. So I think what that brings is, I guess I'd speak back to several of the themes from earlier in the day, the role of everybody to help and stand up for and acknowledge and encourage and welcome diverse voices, I think the other kind of fundamental piece, since we're here at the university and we're talking about what universities can do, is really connecting this interdisciplinarity that opens up different ways of thinking and opens up opportunities for more diversity. And in particular, here at Northeastern, we pride ourselves in teaching our students humanics, which is 3 different kinds of literacies, thinking about human literacy and how human beings are, but also data literacy and technology literacy, and the intersection of all of those is kind of a focus of what we are trying to do with our students. And I think that working on changing, breaking down boundaries and this intersectionality of thought and how we approach learning and our research and our engagement is really important as a mechanism to open up and welcome more diverse learners and people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's clear. So not only women are about to save the world, but men as well. Insaf, in her book Lean In, published a few years ago now, Sheryl Sandberg says that women tend to be shy when it comes to talk about salary. For women, we know that there is often an inverse relationship between advocating for themselves and likability. And after reading the book, basically you've decided to initiate a Lean In circle in France, first by starting by Paris, where you were living, and all of this by yourself to specifically tackle these issues. I'm very curious to know how you, Insaf, alone in Paris, realized that salary negotiation was a real skill that could be mastered. And how did you design this salary negotiation workshop? And how and where did you gather all your knowledge on this subject to make it something, to make it a skill, actually?
Actually, I've realized that salary negotiation and negotiating your value was a very important skill. When I realized, and actually it hit me on the face, that if you let anyone decide on what is your value, you are going to be underestimated.
Systematically?
Systematically.
Okay.
You can gamble if you want to, but if you let someone decide on what is your value, you're going to be underestimated. I was, and I'm a lawyer. I am an international lawyer, and I realized that in my career, I was a top lawyer. I had very good annual reviews, and I was very good at working, and I was doing a good work, but I wasn't giving the raise, and I wasn't giving the rewards. So at some point in my career, I've realized that I sat and I decided to see what was different, why I didn't have what I was supposed to have. Because when you reach 30 years old, when you're a woman, you enter into what we say the real life. 25, 30, whatever. When you quit school and quit college, you jump, and you dive into the real life. And you realize that everything that you have been told is not completely true. Equality is not true in our corporate world, and equality is not completely true in our world. Thus, and therefore, I decided to change that, and I'm just a random woman. I don't have like superpowers, and I was completely desperate when I saw that, and I was like, what I am going to do that will work for me to start off, and then for others. And I am a lawyer, so I'm very factual and rational. And a big part of my job is to negotiate contracts. So I thought that, what about duplicating what you do in your job to salary negotiation? And so I started in my living room with a dozen of women, and I started giving them like techniques of negotiation. And in 1 year, what has started in a living room became a huge thing, and we were in a venues with 100 of women. So you can see that there is an appetite, not on money for women, but there is an appetite on having women, there is an appetite for women to see the world acknowledging their value, acknowledging their work and providing them and giving them the reward of their value. Not more, not less, but the actual equal reward that face their value.
Okay, thank you very much. At that time, when you started the salary negotiation, there were not much content at the Lean-In Foundation here in the US. They were not producing the content they are producing today with regards with mansplaining, technique at work on how to take position if your words are undervalued or your ideas are stolen, or if a man is interrupt you during a meeting, or even salary negotiation. So can you tell us how you were spotted by the Lean-In
The foundation.
foundation here in Palo Alto, and how you started to work with them to develop as well content?
Well, Lean-In is a very young organization. We are 5 years old, so it's very young. And when I get involved in the foundation and in the organization and the movement, it was like they had like 2 years old. So everything has to be built and everything has to be done. And as you said, there weren't a lot of content at that time, even if they started to spot and put words, not because mansplaining, it's not from Lenin, it's an American scholar, but they started
they started to put facts and
exactly,
reports.
exactly.
And,
put word on situation and provide content, quick video, quick explanations of what is that, etc. What happens when somebody stole your ID in a meeting, etc. And in France, there was a huge appetite about the salary negotiation workshop. Basically, we started in Paris, as I told you, in my living room, and then we started doing monthly events on monthly workshop with hundreds of women. And then we toured across France. We called it the Tour de France of negotiation. I'm sure you heard about the Tour de France bicycle, but this was for the salary negotiation. And at that moment, Lean-In is very international. So we have Lean-In basically everywhere. We have, like in the globe, we have 40,000 circle across the world. So we're very international. And at that moment, we started having demands of Lean-In leaders in India, in Pakistan, in Africa, in Europe, in the US, Boston, Palo Alto, New York.
Calling you to...
Asking me to come over and to provide this salary workshop. Negotiation workshop. So we started working with the foundation to see how we can use this content and having a mainstream and provide it to all the community all over the world. So the workshop evolved very naturally, and from the Tour de France of negotiation, it became the World Tour of negotiation. And with that, I had the help and the support and the support of Lean-In Foundation in Palo Alto.
Thank you very much. Brenna, you're at the Mayor's Office for Women Advancement. I was curious to know, where did this idea of designing workshop on pay equity come from? Was it a response to a specific request expressed by the woman citizen in Boston?
Yes, thank you for the question. So thank you all. It's a great opportunity to be here and to share some of this work. Just to provide some context. Yeah. So I work for Mayor Walsh at the City of Boston, and our Office of Women's Advancement, is a policy-focused office, which is fairly unique for cities. So we began our work back in 2014 when Mayor Walsh started his first term. And one of the first things he really wanted to tackle in the city was the gender pay gap. We sort of had to think about what that was going to look like. So we arrived at this sort of philosophy that many folks have talked about here today, which is that we wanted to pair good policy and good laws with a culture shift. And so we figured we couldn't really close these gaps without engaging everyone. So this really had to be collective action. So we started doing, back in 2015, we started working with individuals doing free salary negotiation workshops. So it's wonderful to hear the synergies there. We were the first US city to sort of bring that program to scale so that all of the women who work or live in Boston can take it for free. It's a 2-hour workshop. We now have it online as well. We've trained just about 10,000 women. And NCIF just did an amazing job at sort of explaining why we have to have it, so I won't repeat that. But in addition, we're also working with employers. So we have over 250 employers now signed on to what we call the 100% Talent Compact, of which Victoria was instrumental in getting off the ground in partnership with the mayor. And it's sort of public-private partnership to measure the gender pay gaps so that we have those metrics. We know exactly what the gaps are by job category, by race. This time around, we'll do another measurement this fall, and hopefully we'll also be able to see them by industry so that we can really be benchmarking ourselves and seeing the progress as the years move along. And we're also working with those employers to institute some good practice and policy to start to close those gaps. And sort of the last piece of the pay equity model is working with legislators. So we have a wonderful state legislature here in Massachusetts, and Mayor Walsh was very supportive of the updated Equal Pay Act, which went into effect last summer. And we currently have a bill up that we've proposed as part of Mayor Walsh's legislative agenda called the Pay Transparency and Pipeline Advancement Act, which is really focused on sort of bringing that transparency in terms of reporting for employers. So that's sort of the approach that we've landed on in terms of addressing pay equity from the local level. We sort of had to build that roadmap as we're moving along, and hopefully we'll see some progress as the years go. And we've been sort of lucky enough to hear from cities, states, counties, other countries who are interested in sort of replicating this model in other places. So lots of other cities have started to do the salary negotiation workshops and also have replicated the 100% Talent Compact, which is exciting to sort of see that happen on the kind of grassroots local level.
So in SAF and Victoria, could you tell us more about legislation in France, the US, and maybe in SAF on the G7, so that we just tackled the very local issue, but maybe national and international?
I'll just say briefly, I think one of the things that's really important as we think about how this comes about, and I think what the particulars are somewhat like building blocks that, depending on what is culturally appropriate and politically viable, how much you can get done. But it really does take this broader understanding of both public-private partnership, and then it takes building an ecosystem of not just political will, but social capital within the business community, social capital of women. When you talk about knowing your value, I was chair of the Women's Commission when we put forward, with our legislative colleagues, the Massachusetts Pay Equity Act, which forbid employers from compelling individuals to share their past salary history. And again, evidence-based, that this is from the research and the science, to understand what are the levers which are holding people back. Like, how do you break down cultural barrier? But rather than focusing on the passage of a law or just the salary trainings, that we built an ecosystem. And it's the ecosystem model which is then very successful. My goal was to create a cultural environment, a landscape, where powerful people would elbow each other off the stage to take credit for doing something good for women. That we made it, in essence, a value that people wanted a piece of. And because it's evidence-based, and because there's economic concern even in a strong economy, for not just businesses to understand the value of diversity in women based in the science, as Jenny was referring to with diversity, Scott Page's research and others, but to understand that it's also a national economic imperative. And there's reports from McKinsey and others, which in some ways are, have a model which is pretty far-reaching of how they want to quantify what GDP might look like, but even very conservative models understand greater female attachment to the labor force, which happens when women are paid well. It's funny, if you pay people better, they want to work more. That can really
What a surprise.
change what it looks like. And we see, like Great Britain, for example, had a very forward piece where requiring companies to be able to prove that they have equal pay. We see nations such as Iceland, where if the company doesn't do it well, like quite penalized. We also see penalty in Great Britain. America, I think, will be a little slow to getting to that point, but hopefully we'll get there. I turn over to you. Yeah.
Thank you. In France, basically, we have an history of a long legislation for equality. However, it's not always applied concretely by the people and the corporates. However, even if we have realized that in the past years we were very prolific in terms of legislation and regulation that was applied, but we had this cultural thing that was, as you rightfully said, Victoria, that people doesn't, especially in France, they doesn't share their salary. It's not polite to share its salary. It's not polite to talk about money, and this is not something that people do in general. So which worked for all these corporates and all this ecosystem that was trying to silence all the movement for gender equality, gender pay, to close the gender pay gap. However, we had something very good that happened and was implemented the past few weeks. Actually, on September 1st, is the gender pay gap index. And this gender pay gap index is something very concrete. This is something that we were craving for in France, and all the feminist movement and gender equality movement were craving for, because it's something that is really concrete. This is a ratio that every company has to calculate on 5 criteria. And if you have a ratio that that is equal to a certain 25, which means that your company has no gender pay gap, it's great. If you don't, you can adjust it. And if you really don't want to, you get fined, which is something very important, because we all went to school and we are taught in kindergarten that when we are very small kids, that when you do something that is bad, you get a reward, not a reward, but you get something, you get fined somehow. You have time out or whatever. And if we have big companies and a big ecosystem that is doing something that is wrong and don't get hit their time out moment, which is a fine, and they can get away with what they're doing and not respecting the law, how would you tell people if you level down? How can you tell them to respect the law? So this is something that I think is very good. This is something that we were craving for. And this is something that hopefully will help us move forward in more equality.
Okay, so there have to be first mandatory.
It has to be.
Mandatory rules.
You have a scheme that you have to break at some point. So you break it by telling people that if you don't do it, unfortunately, you have to pay something for it.
Yeah, you're out of the game.
And again, it's that interface between rule of law and statutory protection and culture. And you really can't significantly advance one without the other. And certainly you can't pass laws without that cultural imperative, but you can't change the culture just by wishing it so, or discussing it or wanting it. It has to be enforced.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for all of you. First, I would like to ask you what's your perspective on the best way to prepare women and students to enter a political career or to run for public office. You start first, who you want.
I think what I would say is the most important thing is in any society in the world where women have the opportunity to stand for elected office, if you ask a woman, and here I'll ask you, if I said, will you run, what are the first questions you would think of?
May I be able to manage the work-life balance?
Work-life balance, could I manage it? What might you think?
Do I have the right networks? Do I have the right networks? Do people know who I am?
Do I have the right networks? So can I manage it? And to sum up that feeling, could I win? And that's what most women think about. Could I do this? A little later down that questioning, would I be good at it? And then we get to, do I know enough? And I say that those are really valid questions, and they're the same questions that women look at. But I would like to challenge us by saying they're the wrong questions. And I can say that particularly with my colleagues on the panel. And that the right question would be, what would be lost for my not having participated? And when we hear how articulate and wise the women are up here, just like women that you know in the rest of your lives, this frame of shifting it from how will I be viewed, and if one is watching sort of what in the United States and certainly in Boston, politics can be really a blood sport, and to shift the frame to one of service. And that it's not just about winning or being able to achieve it, but that women's contribution is a fundamentally measurable loss if they aren't there. And you really spoke to that in terms of the climate change. We can see differences. So that getting women to run shifts it from the model of how will I be judged, this is performance, to what it actually is, which is contribution and service. And that often helps women get over that barrier, and it's accurate, and it's sort of a new narrative. So I would say that that's the place to start. And I'll leave it at that. Let my colleagues go.
I guess I would also add that raising issues of gender diversity and the gendered lens on everything throughout the university training or throughout any programming and or encouragement is really important, because a lot of people really don't think very much about gender. And it's surprising. I mean, even in my own career, it's only been more recently as I've gotten more senior and also seen more different things going on.
Did you feel, more comfortable to tackle these issues?
Yeah, with
While you were senior.
Yes, but I also mean people are actually gender blind and racially blind, like thinking that they don't realize the systemic challenges that people are facing, right? And so I think addressing that and raising that so that everybody is more aware of how people are disadvantaged and in different situations to consider running is fundamental. And I guess I would also just say, and that involves, obviously including men in all of those conversations. And I guess I would also say that I am also quite optimistic. There is a lot of demographic shifts, and we have in the United States, we've had some very powerful young women of color, who have really changed the discourse. I mean, if you think about the climate change, the Green New Deal, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the Squad is a group of 4 women of color who all junior representatives who just got elected this past cycle, who have really had a huge impact. So, and that provides impetus and momentum and inspiration and
again,
a lot
whenever
of
you agree or disagree with them, they have had an international impact. They're really followed in France, in Europe. People talk about them, talk about their ideas. So, yeah.
And one of the things that we see with that electoral shift here in the United States by 2040 is, if the trends hold, every major city in the United States will be majority minority. And many already are. And having our cultural idea of who we are begin to match with the actual demographic reality. And this electoral cycle really brought into contrast the difference between the perception that most people had of who we currently are as a society
and
the reality. As well as sort of the new norms of a younger generation, a more global generation, a more technologically engaged generation, where there's not this sense of, quote, waiting one's turn, which usually meant if you're young and female, you don't get a turn, even if you waited. and beginning to see people run. Incumbency in the United States has been a really dampening effect for new voices, and we're beginning to see sort of the norms around that breakdown. It used to be 15 years ago, incumbent, and it's not so different now, but incumbents had a 99% re-election rate. And every incumbent couldn't be doing virtually 100% of a good job, right? But so now we see those norms beginning to break down and more space opening for women.
Brenna?
I think I would just add that it feels really important to me to normalize this issue and to do our parts as adults. So every time we have the opportunity to speak with a group of young adults or children, to sort of ask them if they ever think about running for public office, if that's where they see themselves, and to sort of encourage them to grow up in a world that needs their voices on a public stage like that, I think is important, because I have seen the question asked to groups of, young adults who are shocked that someone even wants to know the answer to that question. So I think just to sort of continue to talk about it and get younger kids to see that that could be their future.
Insaf?
Plus, I will add something that is very important. You can be what you can see.
Exactly.
So if you can be what you can see, if you don't have sufficient minorities, women, people of colors, people of many religions that are running for offices and that are winning offices, you won't have diversity. You won't have the change, the shift in the culture that make accept people that yes, a woman can run and she can win and she can do a good job, or a people of color or a people of different religion, etc. So it's very important to highlight those people, highlight those women, and pass the message to the young generation that they can do it. If they want to do it, they have a very interesting and very helpful support system that can help them, and they can be trained. And this is something that you learn.
Yeah, that they can basically mobilize the resources, that they can look for the resources and find it to be able to run.
And leadership is not genetic. Leadership don't comes with the genetic. Leadership is a skill. This is a muscle that you learn and that you reinforce.
That you train. Yeah, exactly. I do agree. I think we have some minutes to take one question from the audience. Well, no question? Actually, we covered lots of subjects, and I'm very happy about it. We spoke a lot, but that was worth it. So thank you very much for the Northeastern University for hosting us. Thank you for the French Consulate here in Boston, and to the wonderful team of the Consulate to have inviting us and organizing the whole event. And this was the first edition of the Paris-Boston Women's Forum, but I hope it's not the last, and that we will come every year and witness that progress have been made. Thank you so much, and thanks for the panelists. Yeah. And Insaf, sorry, you have a small hint. Sorry.
I just wanted to add something to close this wonderful discussion. Please. We are a product of our past, but we need to not let it define us. I'm speaking to the young women that are here. You are our future. We have inherited our rights from our mothers, and we owe you your rights. So here, with these wonderful women and with these wonderful assistants, we're doing everything that we can to pass on as much right as we can. So I just want to thank last time Arnaud Montré for this wonderful initiative, his team, his wonderful team, and I'm very pleased and very happy to have been able to join you this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Insaf, for this work. Thank you.
We're going to take a short break before the next session. Thank you.